Welcome, everybody. I'm Taryn Higashi from Unbound Philanthropy, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the Changing Hearts and Minds on Immigration and Beating Back White Nationalism webinar. Unbound is thrilled to be supporting People's Action and co-hosting this call, and to support People's Action along with so many others who are on the phones today for this deep, ambitious, challenging, and essential experiment. We support People's Action because they share our values. They emphatically include immigrants and refugees in their definition of a bigger we, and they're dedicated to figuring out how to truly understand and engage people who aren't in the same place, to open up their minds and hearts and consider it again. And they want to win in the short term and the long term, not sacrificing one for the other, but realizing that winning really means knitting together a bigger we, that winning has to look like this. So we're excited to hear what's been learned from the researchers who've been rigorously studying the work, and from leaders who've been doing the door knocking, and from thought partners. So I'm turn it over now to People's Action's chair, and look forward to hearing all about it with you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Chacon. I'm the Executive Director of Colorado People's Alliance and Colorado People's Action, and I'm also the Board President for People's Action. Thank you all so much for joining the call for us to share our work on changing hearts and minds on immigration. I myself am an immigrant from Mexico. I moved to this country when I was 12 years old. The experiences that I faced when I first moved here pushed me to get involved in the immigrant rights movement, one in which I have been part of since 2006. My family is a mixed status family. I've lost 2 family members to deportation in the last 2 years. My dad has been working at a meatpacking plant for the last 20 years. He should have retired years ago, but he can't because he can't afford to retire. My story is one of many within the People's Action Network, a story of why we do this work and why it's important to include the stories of immigrants, communities, and the larger movement to win in 2020 and the years to come. Colorado People's Alliance has been focused on immigrant rights organizing since we started. It is a central issue for our membership, which is majority people of color, and 70% of our members are immigrants. But we understand that we cannot win for our communities alone. That is why I'm so proud of this effort by People's Action to build organizing capacity in rural areas and to use those relationships to engage people in conversations about immigration. The findings from this initial phase of work are promising for the immigrant rights movement and the movement as a whole to create the change that our communities so desperately need right now. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Now I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, George Gale.
Thanks, Lizeth. Good to see you. So welcome, everybody. We were so heartened to see the strong interest in this call. It's been a lot of work to get here, so your interest is affirmation for what we've been doing. Before I get into the heart of the call, I just want to recap a little bit about how we got here, because I think it's informative around how work builds upon itself. So in 2016, as Trump was ascending, we started conversations inside People's Action, and this was a mix of local and national leaders about the need for us to reinvest in race-conscious rural organizing. And because of these conversations, when 2017 hit, we were really ready to come out of the gate and begin seeding new organizing. We intentionally focused on Obama to Trump counties, counties in deep economic decline, and then we picked a set of counties with rising and visible white nationalist organizing. So these were across the board majority white areas. And the organizing was really grounded in kind of 2 core principles: that people in these communities are struggling and needed the power of organizing to address those struggles. If as progressives we are who we say we are, we want to extend that to as broad a community as possible. And secondly, that the organizing would be multiracial and designed to move people in terms of how they think about race, immigration, and more. We started grounded in a traditional organizing maxim of starting where people are at, and that meant starting with listening. So we had 10,000 listening conversations that were really designed to do 2 things: to help us understand what issues people were most concerned about, And I think maybe more importantly was to actually understand how people were making meaning of this moment in American life. And a shout out to Down Home, North Carolina, who I think really modeled that approach for the rest of the network. From there, we began to do what we always do. We organized around the issues that people identified, and we won. We won on issues of Medicaid expansion, expanding opioid relief, a rural living wage, and a number of environmental justice fights. And as we built relationships and trust in the community, we were able to start to have harder conversations, but with support around race, immigration, and the role of government that we wouldn't have been able to have without building the relationships, listening, and actually winning on the issues people identified. And yet we kept running into immigration as the key issue that so many of the people that we were engaging had trouble moving past. And it was really a challenge at the access of scarcity and what was happening in terms of changing demographics in the country. And we knew the right was going to continue to drive and take advantage of that situation, and we needed to replace it with the idea of a bigger we. We weren't alone in seeing this. There's many reports that have come out that have similar findings, but one that really struck me was by Lee Drutman, and he names 20% of the voting public that is really with us on expanding public health care, raising the minimum wage, getting big money out of politics, but anywhere from conflicted to pretty damn messed up on immigration. So we decided to launch a deep canvas project to really test whether deep conversations could move people on immigration, and we teamed up with some of the partners today to test that in a much more methodical way. We believe that done right, this work in majority white areas is in fact racial justice work. It builds on the work of the Race Class Narrative Project, which we're so thankful for. And then before we jump into the program and I hand it over to David, just if we got to thank a few people. From that moment I described in 2017 when we launched our rural organizing, it would not have been possible through the work that we're doing to date without support from the Nathan Cummings Foundation, 11th Hour Project, Carnegie, the Ford Foundation, Wallace Global Fund, Ponterea, the Novo Foundation, Arke Foundation, Unbound Philanthropy, Emerson Collective, Families Belong Together, the Pop Culture Collaborative, Marguerite Casey Foundation, and Suzette Brooks Masters. A big thank you to the folks from our member organizations, Down Home, North Carolina, Pennsylvania Stands Up, and Michigan United. This was hard, rigorous work. Certainly to David Brockman and Josh Kala and Ella and Steve at the New Conversations Initiative. And one of our core partners more recently, the Immigration Strategic Message Project. So thank you to everybody. And now with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Brockman.
Great, thanks so much. David Brockman here at UC Berkeley. So we were the researchers that had the role of trying to measure the impact of this work, and we've been a part of a lot of previous Deep Canvas work as well. So before I get into some of the statistics and the results, I just wanted to set up a bit about motivation here, and George spoke a bit about this as well. And what we see, the data is really clear that, if you look across the world right now, prejudice towards outgroups and opposition to policies that promote their well-being are contributing to right-wing extremism, hate crimes, and political polarization in the US and around the world. If you look at far-right parties around the world, including in the US increasingly, one thing, there's a lot different, but one thing they all have in common is really emphasizing these kinds of anti-immigrant appeals. So how do we try to target these attitudes towards immigrants in the electorate? Well, if you look at the research out there right now, you might be a little dismayed, actually. A lot of campaign outreach in competitive elections tend to have pretty close to zero effect. There's not a lot of clear off-the-shelf tactics where you can say, great, we know how to have big impacts on controversial issues. And likewise, if you look at prejudice, most of the prejudice reduction interventions out there, when they're tested in the field, tend to fail. So kind of one of the big motivations of this project was to try to understand, well, faced with this challenge, what are the effective strategies out there for changing political attitudes and reducing prejudice when we know so many attempts do fail? So I'm going to turn it over to Ella Barrett at the New Conversation Initiative, who's been an important part of every single measurable Deep Canvas program to date, including this one. And she's here to tell us a little more about what deep canvassing is.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. Hi, everyone. At the New Conversation Initiative, we cultivate and train deep canvas projects around the country. And I was on the team that originally created deep canvassing back in 2008 at the Los Angeles LGBT Center, and have spent the last 10 years of my life dedicated to adapting this work to new issues, from climate change to jail reform. So what is deep canvassing? In a deep canvas, canvassers prioritize two things, and we can go to the next slide. So first, the canvasser invites the voter to open up about their complicated feelings on an issue. The canvasser really wants to understand what's pulling the voter to support the issue and what is pulling the voter away from the issue, every shade of gray. Secondly, the canvasser prioritizes sharing life experiences. The canvasser shares vulnerably about their own lives and is curious and asks questions to the voter about what they've experienced. And the ultimate goal here is to ground voters in their real lived experiences, which root them in their empathy instead of fear and prejudice, which pulls them away from us. And you would be truly amazed at how personal voters get at the door when talking to a stranger that they've just met, when we use these deep canvas tools of vulnerability and curiosity. And the reason that this method is such an effective movement strategy is that people are actually really hungry to have non-judgmental space to process right now. So they come out of their partisan corners and leave a deep canvas conversation feeling like they understand each other and can trust each other across party lines in a different way than they've ever thought possible before. So I'm going to turn it back to you, David.
Great. Thanks so much, Ella. So you might have seen a study that we came out with earlier this week with some deep canvas results, working with Kim Serrano's group and some others that you'll hear more about from her in a moment. But we've broadly worked on a lot of issues, including increasing support for transgender inclusive non-discrimination laws, including a scale, doing a version of this on the phone, increasing support for citizenship for undocumented immigrants, more humane enforcement policies, as well as some new results on increasing support for access to abortion. That's not quite out there yet, but you'll be hearing more about in the future, I'm sure. So with this project, though, I think People's Action decided to focus on an issue that I think is really one of the hardest ones that deep canvassing has ever been applied to yet. And it's an issue that it seems like the other side has really focused on and thought of as a wedge issue. This question of whether undocumented immigrants should have access to government healthcare programs. And so to talk more about this, I'm going to turn it over to Bridget Flurry at Downtown North Carolina.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Bridget Flurry with Downtown North Carolina. I remember telling George how concerned I was at how strong the anti-immigrant sentiment was while I was door knocking in Waynesville in the summer of 2017. Getting on the doors after Trump's election, I was deeply worried by how many conversations I was having with mainly, but not all, working class white folks in Southern Appalachia around immigration and scarcity. A big part of my concern was the disconnect at the doors. Healthcare was the #1 issue for folks. The rich and big pharma were named as profiting off of the pain. But when I dug a little deeper into who was to blame, immigrants were always the default as the bigger problem. As an organizer and somebody who believes in and loves the rural communities in which we organize in, I knew these conversations did not mean that these communities were irredeemable. However, after so many years of underinvestment, would our movement really invest in rural communities to make sense of the pain? We know that xenophobia and anti-Black racism is used to win elections. And we know that the only way to beat that back is to invest in multiracial organizing to build a majority progressive movement in this country. But sometimes we talk the talk more than walk the walk. So to figure out a pathway to building that bigger we, I knew we had to invest in a field program that could get to scale, that centered immigration, that took it head on, and really centered empathy and self-interest, and that was the only way forward. No phone script or digital program could do what we needed it to do. You needed to be able to see a person's face and body when they talked about their pain, how they tightened up when they talked about and placing blame on the other, listening deeply, telling different stories, engaging in conversation on front porches about how race is used as an explicit manipulative tactic That was the only way we were going to reduce anxiety, move our communities away from scarcity and towards a belief in multiracial class solidarity. We chose to develop a deep canvas that focused on undocumented immigrants and proposals for universal health care because we knew that was the weapon that the right was going to use to divide and conquer. And this was the best issue to use to surface the intersection between race and the economy. So flash forward to 2019, 2 years later, and we did the darn thing. And I am so proud of the investment from everyone involved because it shows our values in action. Yes, we wanted to reduce prejudice, but we also wanted to move people to a higher calling of seeing that all of our faiths are linked together. And so really for all of us in People's Action, this is way more than just a communication strategy. It's our whole approach to building a multiracial democracy. And right now for Down Home, we have the first African-American woman running for Alamance County Commissioner. We have the first Latinx man running for the State House. And the success of this canvas proves that by walking the walk, we can win.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're going to continue to see in some of the results, I think this really important part of the motivation of this project, which is it's not only about changing people's minds on this policy. It's not about giving them facts and figures about the pros and cons of this particular policy. It's about trying to shift a deeper overall worldview about their attitudes towards immigrants and their role in our democracy. And if you think about trying to change these kinds of deeper attitudes, why might persuasion on this or really any issue be challenging? Well, if you think about it, one reason why individuals often resist persuasion is because yielding to it would pose a threat to their self-image, right? People don't want to admit they're wrong. If we all introspect, we can think about times when we felt defensive and said, wait, you're trying to say that I should think something else, that means what I think right now is wrong. Or say that you're a Trump voter and you know that you like Donald Trump. Well, all of a sudden admitting that maybe immigrants should be included in our democracy, maybe that's going to be uncomfortable because you have to recognize inconsistencies in your views. Or if someone's trying to persuade you on your door saying, I think you should think X, Y, Z, people like to think of themselves as generating their own conclusions and not being susceptible to manipulation by other people. So all of these are generic reasons why persuasion on really any topic that people see as important might be really challenging. So if you think about some of those components of Deep Canvas that Ella mentioned, in part what they're meant to do is to try to overcome and circumvent some of those challenges. So first of all, this idea of non-judgmental listening, asking people for their stories, listening to what they have to say, getting them to acknowledge, well, what's on either side of an issue, listening to what they have to say in a really respectful way. The idea here is that this is going to reduce that threat to self-image, get people to be less defensive, and instead to think more carefully about, well, what is on either side of this? Maybe I should be more open to alternative viewpoints because you're being really open to what I have to say. You're really respecting me. The other thing is sharing stories. Obviously, stories or narratives have been used in different forms of organizing and persuasion for a long time. I think they're important as a part of Deep Canvas as well, and there's a variety of reasons why stories might work particularly well. Some of the major ones are that people perceive stories as less manipulative. If I give you an argument or a fact or a figure, then I'm going to say, okay, clearly you're trying to persuade me. But if I say, well, let me just tell you a story about my friend, then people kind of want to engage in the story and don't want to see it so much as some effort at manipulation. On the other hand, stories can be really good at creating an emotional connection, provoking emotional responses like empathy, and also moving beyond kind of surface level talking points that fit in a sentence or two to think about the complexities and lived experience of an issue. So what I want to do now is walk you through, with the aid of some others on the call, I'm going to show you what this Deep Canvas script actually looks like. Because like a lot of buzzwords out there, people can say, Deep Canvas or story sharing. So I want to walk you through what it actually looks like. These conversations on average took 15 minutes. I won't take 15 minutes to describe it, but just to give you a sense that these are really long form conversations. So when you hear something's a deep canvas, I want to give you a sense of what does that actually mean. So first of all, the conversation started by asking voters what their current views were on healthcare. Are you so-and-so? Great, I'm so-and-so. We're out here today having face-to-face conversations. Where would you put yourself on this 0 to 10 scale? There's literally shades of grade here to say, okay, we're already setting this non-judgmental tone. We want to know, why is that the right number for you? The next thing we do is say, okay, we first asked you about universal health care. What about including undocumented immigrants in universal health care? Let's ask about that. So again, there's this 0 to 10 scale, and we ask, what's the right number for you? What's on either side of the issue? Again, really trying to set that non-judgmental tone. So after that kind of rapport is built and people have said more about what's on either side of the issue to them, the core of this script is 2 different forms of narrative exchange. The first is narratives about undocumented immigrants, or stories about undocumented immigrants. And these stories come from both the voter and the canvasser. So canvassers would ask voters, well, do you know anyone that's moved to the US? An immigrant, an undocumented immigrant, an asylum seeker, anyone else? If you do know someone, tell me about them. When did you learn about them? How did it make you feel? And likewise, the canvasser would share their story. Many of the canvassers were not immigrants. We'll show you that statistic later. So this isn't just about immigrants at the door telling their own story. It would often be people saying, well, let me tell you about my friend or family member. And the idea here is that this non-judgmental exchanging of these stories is going to help people humanize immigrants and take their perspective. There's also a second set of stories in the script related to struggle, saying, well, why don't we, if there's this group of undocumented immigrants, you might have never met an immigrant before, it might be a group you have a hard time empathizing with, but actually, why don't I ask you about a time when you really needed care or support? And that's a situation that we're thinking about undocumented immigrants being in when we're thinking about whether they should be included in healthcare programs. And so the idea here, we call this analogic perspective taking. The idea is that you can kind of understand the experience or get a window into it or take the perspective of immigrants by way of analogy, drawing an analogy from your experience. Oh yeah, I can remember what it was like when my health insurance claim was denied or when I couldn't get the health care I wanted. And then say, you know, there's this group that I thought I had nothing in common with, but actually I realized this situation they're in is actually a lot like the situation that I've been in before. The hope is that this will increase empathy and also prime some of those inclusionary values. To talk more about what this really looks like, I want to turn it over to Maria Elena at Michigan United.
Hello, I'm Maria Elena, and I'm a canvasser with Michigan United. I'm going to speak today about one of my voter stories. I met Inga, a German immigrant in her late 80s, in a mobile home park in rural Michigan. At first, she was a 0 on both scales, which meant she was completely against the idea of universal health care and completely against the idea of including undocumented immigrants in such a program. I told her about the story of an undocumented family I know in Sanctuary personally here in Detroit, Michigan, known as the Rosbergi family. The Rosbergi family came to the United States seeking asylum around 20 years ago. While they waited for their asylum case to conclude, they began working, paying into the tax system, and started a family. Their asylum plea was denied, and unfortunately, this 5-year waiting period, Flora, the wife, had developed MS during that period. Even though their asylum plea was rejected, they continued to apply for citizenship, paid their immigration attorney, and went to every single ICE check-in. 3 years ago, ICE decided that Ded, the husband in the relationship, was deemed deportable, which led them to seek sanctuary in a downtown Detroit church to ensure the livelihood of their children and of Flora. It was at this point in my story that Inga began to empathize and open up. Inga told me about her similar struggles with her husband, who was a Korean War veteran. Inga and her husband had to choose between rationing medications for his Alzheimer's and putting food on the table. Unfortunately, he passed away due to these Alzheimer's complications, and now Inga is facing a similar fate. Inga's story is also very similar to my own. And towards the end of our conversation, even though she wasn't in favor in the beginning, she was in the end. And she realized that we need to fight for a more equitable system for our children and our grandchildren. She was happy and relieved her voice was heard, and she agreed that no matter where we come from or what our color is, we all deserve dignity and a better quality of life. And this story really impacted me because it truly showed how we all go through the same struggles and how we're all being taken advantage of by this broken system. I realized that these conversations strengthen our race-class solidarity. It showed me how important it is for us to advocate for one another and to make sure all our voices are heard so that no one ever has to suffer the way most of us already have. Thank you. I'll pass it back to David.
Great. Thank you so much. So that gives you a sense of the kind of stories that are being shared during that part of the script. After those stories are shared, as we go toward the end of the script, the canvasser turns to making their own case and saying, you know, it's been great to talk to you. Let me tell you more about my perspective on this. And here, the language from the race class narrative that was used in this project is really central. I'm not going to read this entire long script here, but you can see some of this key language about the idea of that we all want the same thing, and that the exact language here differs by state, but in North Carolina, for example, saying we've come together to stop Duke Energy hikes, to win living wages, and we can join together to build power in our communities, et cetera. So you can see some of that race class narrative language that we can get later to later in the call playing a big role here. At the very end of the script, then the canvassers say, well, let's step back here. What's on your mind now that you've been talking? You know, I've been listening to you. You said this on the one hand, you said this other thing on the other. You know, now that you've been talking to me, you know, what do you think? And here, one way to think about what's happening is, voters are conflicted. They're not like politicians where they have one view and all they will say is arguments to have that view. They can recognize there's things on both sides of an issue for them. And after hearing these stories and thinking about their own stories, often it's really salient to them reasons why they might want to act in a more inclusive way than they said at the beginning of the conversation. So this part of the conversation is our opportunity to think more, to have voters think more about what they want to believe going forward. And here, psychologists would call self-persuasion what happens quite often, where voters start to form their own conclusions and state them aloud. They might want to resist when we say it's really important to include undocumented immigrants, but now all of a sudden, voters hear the words coming out of their own mouths. Wow, I really think X, Y, Z. Wow, I just said that. I must believe this. And when we ask them to say, thanks for talking to me, where would you put yourself back on that 0 to 10 scale? We see that voters often rate themselves much more highly. And we ask them to say, well, it seems, before you were a 2, now you say you're at 7. Why is that the right number? What makes you rate yourself differently? Again, to really get voters to hear themselves saying, my mind has changed. So that's what these conversations look like in short. So you saw there were those rating questions on the script. That's not how we measure the effects of these scripts. That's merely used as a way to kind of help the conversation proceed and make clear to the voter that we're listening to them, get a sense more qualitatively at the door what's working. But in parallel to all of this, Josh Kalla at Yale and myself were doing a field experiment to measure whether these conversations actually work. Because we know there's a ton of well-intentioned approaches out there that work really well in focus groups, or there's great anecdotes for, but actually don't work out in the real world. So we did a real world randomized experiment to try to figure out whether this works. And in brief, here's how this experiment works. We begin with a group of voters across these 3 states where the experiment took place. We sent them a letter saying, please join at the time I was at Stanford, the Yale-Stanford Opinion Survey. We invite them to this survey. So those who want to take it, go online. We incentivize them with gift cards for taking the survey. And the idea is that this survey is supposed to be completely unrelated to the canvassing. We have a lot of questions. Most of them have nothing to do with immigration. We want to know how's the economy doing for you right now. We want to know your views on Trump, et cetera. Then we randomly assign the people who took this survey to one of 3 conditions. There's a placebo condition. These folks are our control group. So these are the people that did the survey, will come to their door on the day of. We could have done this exercise with that we just showed you, but we don't. And then there's 2 groups that we did the deep canvas with. For the most of this call, I'll just combine them into one. Both groups got basically the entire script. In one of them, we took out the second bin of story sharing related to struggle stories. So everyone's getting stories about immigrants, everyone's getting the race class narrative, and we're just reducing to some extent that second bucket of story sharing in the second group. Next, everyone who is reached at the door, about a week later on average, they get a follow-up email from Yale and Stanford saying, we'd like you to do a follow-up survey. Again, we're not telling them this is part of the canvassing or whatever else, just you were invited to a series of surveys, now the next one is here. We have a lot of questions in this survey that have nothing to do with immigration or including undocumented immigrants, but a few that do. And we also then invite those folks to another follow-up survey 6 months later. And we're going to keep doing follow-up surveys into the future as well that are not yet launched. You guys are getting an early take on this before all the results are back. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like, the voters who were canvassed broadly look like the communities where this was done. We see the voters are about roughly half white, half people of color. The plurality of them identify as conservatives, and approval of Trump about tracks the national average. The canvassers, about 44% of the canvassers are people of color, about 56% are non-Hispanic whites. Only about 16% are actually immigrants. So when you think about this canvassing, you shouldn't think of it's just about meeting an immigrant at the door, because actually the vast majority of the canvassers are not immigrants themselves. As I mentioned, the median length of the conversation is about 15 minutes. These are long, in-depth conversations. When we're talking about sharing stories, people really get into the details. They really do have a conversation. It's not just one sentence and move on. And this is not at all a supportive sample. So this isn't too different than the national average here, but what we see in this sample, it's only 21% of people that support including undocumented immigrants in universal health care at baseline. Okay, so now we're going to look at the results. And to look at these results, what we're going to do is compare the people that did the baseline survey. So we mailed them, did the baseline survey, came to the door, and just because of the proverbial coin flip, we either gave the deep canvas to, or we could have, but we didn't. So we're comparing apples to apples, people that look exactly the same at the beginning, and just due to the random assignment, either got the deep canvas or not. So first of all, here are the results on 3 questions around healthcare policy. We asked 3 different survey questions. There's 3 different ways that surveyors will talk about, and Americans generally often talk about, undocumented immigrants. There's the undocumented immigrant language, there's unauthorized immigrants, and also illegal immigrants. We have survey questions that use all 3 because we thought respondents might be familiar with different terms, and we also wanted the survey to seem very neutral and unconnected to the canvassing. And what we see is no matter which aspect of this policy related to healthcare and undocumented immigrants and what survey question we use, we see that for every 100 completed canvas conversations, there's approximately 8 new supporters. And that's looking 1 week later. So if a canvasser says, okay, over the course of a week, I've had 100 completed conversations, out of those 100 people they've talked to, your best guess would be 8 of those conversations led someone who originally was opposed to become a supporter. Now, oftentimes in these deep canvas programs and persuasion more generally, we can see effects that are there. This is 1 week after the intervention. But when we look at tactics like television ads and other forms of mass communication that have initial effects, what we see is that after a matter of days or maybe a week, they tend to rapidly decay. So from my point of view, the real proof in the pudding for persuasion is what happens when you look later on, after people might have forgotten what has happened or seen more opposing messages. What we see here is that when we look 6 weeks later, the effects are actually the same, if not a little bit bigger. So on the high end, we see that on this question of including undocumented immigrants in healthcare coverage under a new program that would provide all Americans healthcare coverage, there's actually 11.8, so almost 12 in 100 of people. Almost 12 of every 100 people that have a completed conversation end up being someone who went from being an opponent to being a supporter. So if we take the conservative end of that, so 8 percentage points, that's the smallest estimate we saw, how big is that? How big is 8 in 100? Hard to get a sense of that sometimes, but just to give you a few external points of comparison, there's obviously been a lot of consternation about what happened between 2012 when Obama won Midwest states and what happened in 2016 when Trump won many of them, such as Michigan. 8 percentage points is larger than the size of this shift from Obama to Trump in Michigan from 2012 to 2016. That big shift that changed the fate of American politics, this was a larger shift than that. It's also about the size of about 6 years of change on attitudes towards gay marriage as those campaigns were at their height. And for those of you familiar with the effects of social pressure on voter turnout, the largest effects that have ever been seen of social pressure on voter turnout are smaller than the effects we're seeing here. So these are larger than even those effects that are regarded as really just some of the biggest effects that we've seen out in politics. Another thing I mentioned another important point here is that the people moving, we're not just taking the people who are already liberals or already kind of progressive and taking them to our side. What we see is that when we split out the results by people who are Trump supporters and not Trump supporters, so here the Trump supporters are in blue, and the people who disapproved of Trump are in red, we see that unsurprisingly, the people who already disapproved of Trump were a little more open to our message, but we still see pretty large and statistically significant effects that those who approve of Trump are still moving. And so we have Trump supporters in this study who, at the beginning, almost none of them supported including undocumented immigrants in these programs. But by the end, we saw 4 to 4.5 percentage points of those people switching to saying, actually, even though I'm a Trump supporter, I still think we should include undocumented immigrants in these programs. Another important feature of these results is that, as I mentioned, part of the theory of change here is, yes, we absolutely care about this issue, but we're talking about this issue as well as a way to talk about these deeper concerns that people have about including undocumented immigrants in different parts of American democracy. So we also asked some other policy questions that were never discussed at the door to say, is there evidence that we're changing a deeper worldview here? Not just how they think about this narrow policy, but something where when whatever the next policy fight is, they're going to think about that differently as well. And so to test that, we had 3 questions here, one of which, for example, was whether undocumented immigrants should be included in the SNAP program, the food stamp program. And what we see is that on that issue, there's a 6.4 percentage point increase. We see increases in in-state college tuition as well. For allowing their children to go to public schools, that one, almost everyone supported at baseline, so there wasn't much more room to move. There's kind of a ceiling effect there. What we broadly see is that on other policy questions, there's effect of this canvassing as well, despite, again, that these are never mentioned at the door. And we see that these effects appear to last for at least 6 weeks as well. So these effects are there, and that's kind of more evidence of this worldview that's shifted over time. We also asked some questions to get at prejudice. So these are questions that don't ask about should the government do X or Y, but how do you think of undocumented immigrants more generally? Do you think they hold the same values as you and your family? Do you think they deserve care and support? Or do you see them as a burden on your community? And what we see is that broadly across these questions, these kinds of prejudice statements go down, and more supportive statements like deserving our care and support go up. We also see measurable persistence in these views, although the estimates bounce around a bit. So our best guess is that some of this reduction in prejudice and worldview shift appears to be persisting as well. As I mentioned, this was a C3 project, and part of what we did to disguise our impact, though, is we asked lots of questions about other things just to disguise what we were doing. And so we asked some questions about people's views about Donald Trump, just as filler questions to put in the survey. But after we saw how big these effects were, we said, I wonder, given how big these effects are, those Trump questions that we put on there as filler, I wonder what we'll see when we go look at them. And although these are borderline and not all of them are statistically significant, we see some suggestive evidence that actually, to our surprise, Trump approval and intentions to vote to re-elect Trump actually seem like they were going down in the group that got this canvas as well. Again, despite the fact that Trump is not part of the script at all. To talk more about kind of this big change and what these kinds of big changes look like, I'm going to turn it over to Ona Sai at Pennsylvania Stands Up.
Hello, I'm Ona Sai. I'm with Pennsylvania Stands Up. I actually came to this project in a different way than many of the other people who did. I was canvassed at the door, and they asked me my opinion about universal health care and including immigrants, and I was so touched that someone actually came to my door to ask me questions about how I feel. I ended up becoming part of the project and being one of the canvassers that went door to door. And I want to share a story with you about someone that I actually canvassed where I feel like we really made a difference. I canvassed a young white guy in a rural area outside of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He was very stone-faced. He was not emotional. He was not interested in sharing with me. And he was opposed to universal health care. He was opposed to immigrants being included in universal health care. But he allowed me to share my story with him, and I shared story of my aunt who had been here undocumented and had been deported, and it took 25 years for her to come back, and the effects that had had on my family and my life. And he still was pretty unemotional and didn't seem like he connected. And he asked me, why I felt that we should have to take care of other people, and why we shouldn't just have to take care of our own families. And I shared with him that I used to be a person who felt that way, that we shouldn't have to care for other people. But then I became a mother, and becoming a mother had made me have to share with the world, and made me had to appreciate other people and understand their experiences who are different than mine, and have to interact with them. When I shared this with him, I could see the color come back to his face. I could see that this had touched him. He looked at his daughter who was standing next to him on the porch, and then he said to me, I guess I never thought about it in the way of how our own personal experiences will affect our opinions. And so we finished our conversation, and when we came towards the end of our conversation, I asked him again how he felt about these issues, and he was still pretty opposed to universal health care, but he did tell me if we were going to have universal health care, he would want everyone to be included. He would want his kids to be included, just like he would want any immigrants' kids to be included. And I could tell that this conversation had had a deep impact on how he felt about that issue and just about immigrants in general. This is why this work is so important, and why it's changing people's minds.
Great, thanks so much. So yeah, so hopefully over the course of this presentation, you get a better sense of what these conversations actually look like. It's a lot of work. It's not just as simple as reading a couple sentences off of a page. They're vulnerable conversations. They involve a lot of work from canvassers, the organizations, and the voters. But these results show, I think, that that work really does pay off. So just to summarize a few of the key findings, I know I've thrown just a bunch of numbers at you. What we see is that for every 100 conversations that are completed, there's a little more than 8 new people that support undocumented immigrants being eligible for Medicaid that would not have supported that otherwise. There's about 6.5 new people per 100 conversations that think undocumented immigrants should be eligible for SNAP and food stamps. There's a 5.4 percentage point decrease, or 5.4 people per 100 people who we have a completed conversation with no longer believe undocumented immigrants are a burden in our society. And we also see this suggestive change in Trump support as well. So these big shifts across the board. Just because I know these are questions that I'm sure you all will have, let me answer them right off the bat. Who's most affected by this? What canvassers are most affected? How can we target this? Well, what we generally find, honestly, is that, and this is pretty similar to what we see in a lot of other types of these programs, basically all canvassers are successful with this. When we look across the different sites in North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, there's basically effects in all those places with different organizations, different voters, and different canvassers. Both the canvassers of color and the white canvassers are similarly effective. It's similarly effective with both immigrant and non-immigrant canvassers. So this is not all driven by immigrant canvassers being at the door. And likewise, both canvassers sorry, I already said that. Likewise, when we look at voters of color and white voters are similarly affected by this. Both men and women are similarly affected. There's slightly larger effects among women, but they're definitely there for men as well. Again, when you look at partisanship and Trump approval, we see that Democrats and people who disapprove of Trump are slightly more affected by this, but there are clear effects among Trump supporters and Republicans as well. So that's just to say, although this isn't just a story of immigrants being at the door, or independent voter, independent women, or something like that. Really, any kind of canvasser you imagine, beating any kind of voter you would imagine, the evidence suggests these kinds of conversations will have some effects that are pretty sizable. So just to summarize and conclude, what we found here is that People's Action's Deep Canvas increased voter support for including undocumented immigrants in the social safety net, both in terms of healthcare and in terms of other policies that were not explicitly discussed. And those effects persist at least 6 weeks post-canvassing, in contrast to so many other forms of persuasion and mass communication where people are temporarily persuaded but then regress to where they were before. We see these effects last. We also see evidence that there's a decrease in prejudice towards undocumented immigrants. These kinds of prejudice statements that are a little deeper, have nothing to do with politics and weighing the pros and cons of a policy or messages about a policy, just feeling like undocumented immigrants are not a burden, they deserve our care and support. And last, why are these conversations effective? You've heard a little bit about this already, but in our own debriefs with the canvassers, we've heard a lot of similar kinds of feedback, that this kind of creating this non-judgmental context where people can think through things aloud, share their stories, hear what immigrants have really allowed themselves to identify with immigrants more is really important. One interesting additional experimental result I mentioned briefly, that there were those two groups, one group that got the struggle story I showed you, and one group where we just took out that part. Broadly speaking, we find that the canvas is effective with or without that struggle story. That doesn't mean the canvas without the struggle story is not a deep canvas. Those are still long conversations, around 15 minutes, really just focusing more on the story of immigrants and talking about those. Voters are often still talking about their lives. But that's just to say, one more result showing that this basic paradigm can be really effective in lots of different ways of trying to implement it. So thank you so much for your attention as I went on and on here. But now I'm going to turn it over back to the other panelists. And thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, David, and everybody. That was great. So I'll just say one thing. I had the opportunity to canvass in all 3 of the states, and some of the conversations just kind of were very stereotype busting in terms of what's possible. And every place had conversations where people actually moved, and I think were surprised to move. It was amazing. But with that, we're going to get some kind of responses from a few people who just we asked to be on the call and listen, and then just say what came to them after hearing the presentation. So first, we're going to start with Manny Lopez from UC Berkeley. I think most people know Ian as the author of Dog Whistle Politics and has a new book out called Merge Left. Ian?
Thank you so much. So, just blown away by this. Part of the reason I'm so blown away is because I had the opportunity to join Down Home North Carolina for canvassing there. incredible learning experience for me to really see how it worked and to really see people move in their opinions. I think that the strength of this particular approach is that it combines a methodology and a message that reinforce each other. So the methodology is really about empathy and a sense of human connection. And I really want to emphasize the way in which the message stresses that as well. This is a message of linked fate. The core of the race-class narrative approach is to say intentional division is the main weapon that economic titans are using against all of us. And as a result, the intentional creation of social solidarity is the best possible way for us to respond. And that as a response, this has two components. One, we have to promote racial justice, and we have to promote racial justice in a sense of cross-racial solidarity, precisely because it's racial division that's being weaponized against us. And two, we have to promote economic fairness and economic justice, because we need to make sure that everybody sees, whether they're whites or people of color, that their own family's well-being, their health care in this instance, depends upon coming together as part of a large multiracial group, a large multiracial progressive movement, I should say. So just to reiterate, this is really a story of linked fate. And this is something that Bridget said, and again, a shout out to Bridget at Down Home, North Carolina. I learned so much from them. As Bridget said, this is much more than a communication strategy. Mm-hmm. This is an approach to building a political movement. This is an approach to building the new world that all of our families deserve. And that new world is one in which we recognize our shared humanity, understand at a deep substantive level that our fates are linked, and work together to make sure that all of our families are taken care of. So thank you to People's Action, Down Home, North Carolina, the new Conversation Initiative. Amazing, amazing work.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, so great to be working with you on this. Next up, we're going to hear from Kimberly Serrano from the California Immigration Policy Center. Kimberly?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Looks like I'm off mute. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to People's Action for the invitation to join today's conversation. I had the privilege and pleasure of leading the first immigration deep canvas to get a positive measurable result with Ella from the New Conversation Initiative and Josh and David, who are also on the line today, alongside partners in Tennessee and Orange and Fresno counties in California. And I was really encouraged to hear that the People's Action folks were looking to build on that work and canvas in some new places around immigration issues and the intersection with scarcity and health. Because it's been really exciting to see a learning community around this tactic growing and building upon each other's work. Our canvas were the beneficiaries of the incredible work from the marriage equality movement, as well as canvases to combat transgender discrimination. I know there have also been canvases around reproductive justice and other issues, and there has just been so much good learning. And this call is making me think quite a bit about a tweet, actually, that I just saw in the last week from Ezra Klein, who is a founder of Vox.com and a podcast host, commenting on the article that David mentioned that came out last week, sharing some of the results from our canvas, which are very similar to this canvas, as well as the canvas to combat transgender non-discrimination. And he said that the more and more he learns about persuasion, the more he realizes it's not about winning an argument, but about building a relationship and holding space. And I think that's one thing that I have taken away from this experience, and I'm taking away from this call, and the generous stories from Una and Bridget and Maria Elena about the importance of relationship to this work. And I just want to underscore, for folks on the phone who are working in immigration and who are thinking about the expansion of the Muslim ban on Friday and the information about public charge and going into effect as a result of Supreme Court's decision last week, that these issues will take us beyond November. And so there are very important, I think, takeaways that this tactic has for the run-up to November. But I think it's also really important for the sustainability of immigration and pro-immigrant work November as well, and the big work that we have ahead to help build a public imperative for change on this issue. So looking forward to the conversation with folks on the phone, and thanks again for the invite to join this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Okay, next we're gonna close out in terms of the responses, and then we'll get to a few questions. Taryn Higashi from Unbound Philanthropy.
Can you guys hear me? Thanks so much to everybody who spoke, and just hats off to you. We at Unbound have so much admiration and gratitude, and we're so inspired by what we've heard. I think what attracted us to the project, in addition to the shared values and vision and goals that I mentioned at the start, was all of the thought that went into planning it. It really builds on and stands on the shoulders of deep canvassing in the past, and so much was invested by people's action in figuring out who to survey, in doing this, running the experiments with this rigorous research, and to get it all done in time to be able to implement and take it further this year. And I just think that is so admirable. And I really have a question I'm ending my comment with a question, which is to hear what it takes to do this work, what you have invested, George and team, and if you could take it further, in partnership with other organizations that are working similarly, who want to replicate it. What could you do? What would it look like? Could you just give us a sense of, your ambition and dream? What would you like to see happen in the coming months, as well as in the coming years? Because we agree, Kimberly, that the issues that are being grappled with here that need that radical empathy and knitting together are going to last beyond November. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Taryn. Thanks for helping us out getting this call organized too. I'll say a couple things on your question, and if particularly if any of the folks from the Canvas states want to weigh in, but I think what it takes, I think in the beginning it just took like certainty that this work had to happen. It was not a popular idea for a lot of people in 2017. We decided we were going to target these specific communities. So I think kind of like my dad always taught me, new ideas are like a little baby and you got to protect them, and they'll get shot down a lot. So I think more than anything, we just kind of stuck with it. I'd say second, like a belief that the work builds upon itself. This work would have not worked if we had parachuted into communities and come to talk to people about immigration, but we had credibility and legitimacy from being there. And then I don't know if any of the folks that have done way more canvassing than me want to talk about what it takes to do it on the doors. And I'll just say one thing. I had one night in Pennsylvania that I swear to God, Sean Hannity answered the door 5 doors in a row, and was not a night I was feeling hopeful about the work. And you're going to run into that on the door. So I don't know if anybody wants to quickly say what it takes to move through that.
I can say as far as Pennsylvania, we had a lot of Sean Hannitys at the door. There's lots of them out here. But we made a commitment to each other to see the project through. And we have made a commitment for a lot of us who didn't have immigrants in our family, have made commitments for other people that they love, that this is something that they wanted to see a better future for other people. And sharing the same stories every day about your loved ones and people that you know and care about. And hearing other people's stories and taking them in just strengthens you every single day to go out there and keep knocking every door and keep trying to change everyone's mind as much as you can. So that was really what motivated our Pennsylvania team.
Thank you. Super helpful. That's exactly right. So, and just lastly, and this I think lines up with the question that Rini was asking earlier around scale. Just a little bit of forecasting what's next. Like, this was intentionally, it was a bite-sized project in terms of us trying to learn from this. So we want to expand both the number of counties that we're in the current states and expand into counties in some of the states that we're not in. And Adam, who's one of the leaders of this project from the national staff, has kind of been tilling the soil for that expansion. So we just want to have way more conversations per night as we build through 2020. And those conversations won't reach the scale we need. For this project, we were not able to move the people we met on the doors into organizing because they were part of an experiment, which was very frustrating for a lot of the campusers and organizers, but that was the way it worked. So then the organizing actually helps deepen a lot of what people learn, a lot of the meaning making that's happening around race and immigration and other issues. And then we want to overlay a digital strategy that really helps us reach both more people, but a digital strategy based on the same principles of what's worked thus far on the doors, but also overlap that. I'll never forget early in this work when Bridget told me, like, we'll make all this progress with folks and then they leave and go back into a very conservative and racist surround sound, and then we've got to pull them back out again. So we need more ways that we're touching people. So those are some of the key projects. I think we don't have a lot of other questions in the chat, so I think I'm just going to close with some of the key things of what we've got planned next. So we'll be publishing a full report on this work and the findings, what worked, what we've learned through this project in February. And then we're going to take some of the folks on the call and others on the road and visit New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco to actually bring more of you all in as thought partners on what the next phase of the work looks like. And so that we expect those conversations, those meetings to all happen in March. We are going to do similar webinars like this with more of the field, our allies and movement partners. We got a big request. Some of those folks, are on today, but we want to do more of that so we can popularize what we've learned here and figure out how more people can move it. A reporter from a high leverage publication to be named later was embedded with us during this project, went out and canvassed in both Michigan and North Carolina. And so there's a story that'll be coming out March 1st. The information on this call, at least in terms of media, is embargoed until that comes out on March 1st. And just a few more things. We're launching a qualitative research project to inform the next phase of the narrative strategy. That'll include focus groups and being able to go deeper so we can more fully understand what's working. We'll scale up C3 and C4 strategies in key states. Some of the funding is already coming into that. And then run an integrated field and digital strategy, which we're currently working with the Immigration Hub in Michigan and Pennsylvania. And then finally, our goal for this project in 2020 is to raise $2.75 million, a mix of C3 and C4 resources to run this program. So that's what's next. If people do have questions, we'd love to get them through email. You can, I think Jen put the, my contact or her contact in the chat. We can send it out again, but we want to learn with you. We want to engage more. We also kind of committed to keep the call at an hour. So thank you guys so much. Thank you all the funders who supported the work, all the allies and people whose work we've built on, and everybody for joining the call. It's been great. Thank you.